Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dan Powers. I'm the Executive Director of the Society for Science at User Research Facilities, and I want to welcome you to another session during our 2021 annual meeting. This session features Barbara Helland with the Department of Energy describing the High Performance Computing Consortium regarding COVID-19 research that got started in early 2020. In the original recording of this session, there was a glitch that cut out the introduction that I had made of Barbara. So I'm adding in this introduction to herself. And then when we get started with the session, you'll have missed just about a minute. It was really the introduction that I gave to her. But I would like to provide this introduction to Barbara, and then we'll go right into the session as it was recorded on November 10th, 2021. Barbara Helland is currently the Associate Director of the Department of Energy's Office of Science's Advanced Scientific Computing Research Program. In addition to her Associate Director duties, she's leading the development of the department's exascale computing initiative to deliver a capable exascale system by 2021. That's all in process right now. And she's also served as the Executive Director of the COVID-19 High Performance Computing Consortium since its inception back in March 2020. An incredible program. Wait till you get to the session's details. A little more background. Ms. Helland previously served as ASCR's Facilities Division Director, and she was also responsible for opening the ASCR's facilities to national researchers, including those in industry, through the expansion of the department's innovative and novel computational impact on theory and experiment program, otherwise known as InSight. Prior to the Department of Energy, Ms. Helland developed and managed computational science educational programs at the Krell Institute, and she also spent 25 years at Ames Laboratory, working closely with nuclear physicists and physical chemists to develop real-time operating systems and software tools to automate experimental data collection and analysis, and in the deployment and management of lab-wide computational resources. She received a BS in computer science and a master's in education in organizational learning and human resource development from Iowa State University. So thank you. With that introduction, I'm going over to Barbara's presentation. Thank you, Barbara.
And what we're doing today. So let me just step back a little bit pre-COVID. Certainly, high-performance computing has always been a great ally during national emergencies. I know many of the facilities that OSCAR supports have looked at the Deep Horizon oil spill. We've modeled seismic earthquake prediction and the impacts of earthquakes. And certainly we have, many of the facilities had early use in looking at maybe the SARS vaccine, the bird flu, and things like that. And other agencies, high performance computing has looked at wildfire, tornadoes, et cetera, and hurricanes, of course. So it's always having access to these general purpose computing resources support science, both in compute and data intensive workload. And like I mentioned before, OSCAR's high performance computing facilities have actually used these resources many times to tackle great scientific problems and national emergency. And in COVID, we actually hastened the marriage of AI with high performance computing to do deep research, deep dives into many different aspects of COVID. And I have a couple of slides on what we did there. But let me step back and talk about what DOE did during COVID. I'm not sure if Harriet mentioned when she talked yesterday about the National Virtual Biology Laboratory, but that was bringing all of the department's 17 labs together to share our research facilities to fight COVID. But today I want to focus on what the high performance computing centers did. We formed the HPC High Performance COVID Consortium. If you don't know about it, it's a unique private-public effort that was spearheaded by the IBM and the White House Office of Science and Technology that brought together not only federal government, but we brought together cloud vendors and academic HPC. And we volunteered our compute time, our expertise, and other research or sources in support of COVID-19. just looking at the consortium today, we currently have 43 consortium members. We have provided support for over 100 projects, and I'll go more into the details of the project later. But if you aggregate all of the resources that the consortium members bring, we have about 165K nodes with 6.8 million compute cores, but more importantly, we had over 600 petaflops that we could provide to the community, the researchers in the community, to support their efforts to combat COVID-19. This timeline is very interesting because you can see that we actually stood up the consortium in 10 days. The idea was launched with Dario Gil at IBM. It was his idea. He was aware of the IBM platforms that were across many of the federal agencies and other institutions, and thought it would be, gee, can't we do something to bring everybody together? So IBM reached out and explored this with DOE labs, other universities on between the 13th and the 18th. And by that time, I was my undersecretary at the time, Paul DeBar, was brought into it. Now, we had already been working on using our HPCs to support COVID. And it was fortuitous that early on we'd established in Oscar an allocation program called the Advanced, the Leadership, Oscar Leadership Computing Challenge. And as part of that, we identified that it was to, provide resources to critical projects within DOE, but more importantly, it was to broaden the use of our HPC and to support national emergencies. So that when my leadership got questions about why we were supporting COVID on our machines, we could point to something, an allocation policy that had been posted and said, no, we've always said that we were going to do this. So that helped us actually bridge, the concerns that Congress would have that we were not operating within our mission space, because this was supporting a national emergency was in our mission space. And it also helped us get some CARES Act funding to actually support additional cabinets at my 3 facilities at Oak Ridge, Argonne, and Berkeley, and also at the NNSA labs of Los Alamos and Livermore. So this started before March 11th. We just started these discussions, but we were very interested in using our resources to support this. Once the idea was taken to Michael Kratsios, who at that time was the CTO of the United States at OSTP, he brought in others like Jake Taylor to help organize this. And then we reached out to NSF, which was extremely important because NSF brought to the table something that really made this happen quickly, and that was the exceed process that they have to take in projects, review projects, and then we could work to give allocations. So without that, we would have had to actually build this whole application process from scratch. The other thing, so we brought in NNSA, we brought in MIT, RPI was interested, NASA was brought in through OSTP. And at the same time, they reached out to Amazon, Google, and Microsoft. And basically, I think we'll go to the next slide. I think those are the key founders of the consortium. But what is important to note, indeed, we had the exceed process, but we all agreed to do this and didn't get any lawyers involved. I think that's why we could do this in 10 days. We all agreed that we were going to provide resources and we were going to provide support to help people use the machines. But that was the only thing we signed up to do. I mean, so there was we didn't get lawyers involved. We didn't have to worry about IP. We didn't have to worry about who was doing who was doing what. We just were all concerned to get on the same page and see what we could do to help. So you can see here the first proposal. The president announced this on a Sunday, March 22nd. We had our first proposal submitted on March 24th. Actually, it was by Jeremy Smith from Oak Ridge. By April 15th, we had 50 proposals submitted, and our first 100 proposals were submitted by May 9th. and so we have 50 projects. And by end of May, we had 50 projects online. Again, here's the consortium board members as it's constituted today. Certainly, IBM, Google, HPE, Amazon were all early partners in this. I mentioned NSF and NASA. RPI, Dan Stanzioni from TAC is a part of an NSF center, and then representatives from DOE labs and other areas that actually serve as board members. The board still meets once a month. The Scientific and Computing Executive Committee meets weekly to actually do a lot of work in between the board meetings. I think our membership and alliances committee at this point is close to sunsetting. I think we recently had a request to join the consortium, but we haven't had a request to join for several months. Who are the members? So we had consortium members and affiliates. I kind of identified the first members. Certainly the DOE National Laboratories, it was the 6 that you think of, plus Idaho National Laboratory. Academic institutions, we have the academic institutions associated with NSF, of course, and others like Carnegie Mellon, RPI, MIT, Ohio Supercomputing Center. But early on in the consortium, we had interest expressed to us by academic institutions in the United Kingdom. The Swiss National Supercomputing Center and Swedish National Infrastructure for Computing were all interested in joining the consortium. So again, we worked through a lot of this process with no signed statements. We all just agreed. We had to figure, and I'll talk to it in the next slide, but we had to figure out how they could join the review and matching committees, because that's what all of the members get to do. They get to put a member on the matching teams and the review teams. But we also, and at the same time, we had other international partnerships with Japan and Korea. And other industries joined us, certainly Dell, DA Shaw, Microsoft, NVIDIA, Intel, and the affiliates weren't full members, but what they did was provide technologies for our users that perhaps they might need a special data software package, or they might need, help on putting their codes across the storage, which HDF group might help with. So they don't have members, they don't have fully members on the review committees or matching committees, but we do let the projects know about the resources that they offer. So, okay, we get these projects in, then what happens? Well, we do have a review process. Again, we were using the Exceed process. Each of the members of the consortium provided a reviewer for the review subcommittees. At the beginning, when we were receiving lots of projects, we met 3 times a week to review projects. And we met in the mornings, and then in the afternoons, we had another subcommittee, again, made up of all the members that actually matched the projects to the resources. Now, in many cases, the researchers are familiar with the resource and would ask for a specific resource. But in the case that they didn't, then there would be a discussion, well, this project is a logical fit for, say, a cloud environment, or a logical fit for TAC or one of the DOE facilities. And sometimes there are a couple or 2 or 3 of the people on the matching committee would raise their hand and say, we're interested. So the project would get support from a number of the members. A case in point is Jeremy Smith was asking for a lot of time, say, at Oak Ridge, and we didn't have enough time. But Google stepped up and said, gee, we would like to give Jeremy some time there too. Well, the benefit of this was it helped Jeremy actually figure out how he could take part of his work to the cloud. Again, like I say, the proposal requests have gone down, so we're going to meet, we've gone to a time frame where we're only meeting once a week on the review committee and once a week on the matching committee, but we're still active. And if people here are interested in, and at the end I have a slide of topics that we're still interested in, researchers should go to the covid-hpcconsortium.org and submit a proposal. So just a few details on the projects that we received. We've received 217 projects and approved 112. Now my caveat here is we let people resubmit many times. And so the number of 217 includes a number of resubmissions. And of those, after going through a screening, 196 of the 217 were eligible for review. We only returned 21 without review because they weren't focused really on COVID, and declined 80. But again, those 80, and once we declined, could come back and resubmit after they looked at the reviewers' comments and redid their proposal. And this information on the right-hand side of the screen, it talks about the types of institutions that we got proposals from. Again, you can see they're from U.S. and non-U.S. and a university, and from both, and certainly R&D and some medical organizations. And 32% of the projects with experimental, clinical, and policy transition have those transition plans in place. So early on, we developed a topology for how we could categorize the projects. And you can see we focused on basic science, therapeutic development, which is, and you'll see even examples I'm going to show in a little bit, that we're focused on target discovery, design, understanding the antibody, vaccine and protein design, repurposing, and developmental, which is under therapeutic development. But, basic science, we wanted to know the structure of COVID. What is the human viral interactions, if we could figure that out with early data? What were the environmental effects? And probably the least amount of projects that we received were actually focused on the patients. And we were trying to, as it went on, we got more of those projects, but certainly medical technology, supply chain and resource allocation, and that was important early on with the ventilators. Critical thing toward the end, as before we went into the vaccine mandates, was the epidemiology. What happens when you open up schools? What happens when you open up bars? If they close an hour earlier, what happens? And again, this is social interaction analytics. So you can see the number of projects that we got in each of the categories. So here I've just culled some of the highlights from the facilities that Oscar manages. And certainly I talked about Jeremy Smith, who used COVID resources through the consortium to identify drug compounds for the treatment of COVID-19. So they actually initially screened 8,000 drug compounds and identified 77 that might be potential candidates. And later, with more COVID resources, they were able to identify 1.5 billion chemical compounds in 24 hours on Summit. Early on in the COVID, a lot of people were publishing the results that they found. So what was key across many agencies, and including NSF, DOE, was to look at the literature that was being published at the time. And this is what they did at NERSC-ONCORE, was they did the COVID Scholar, where they created a portal that they could search records of researchers to find the latest research. I mentioned the importance of understanding as we were coming out, as cases were winding down, to understand what happens with interventions in future scenarios, and that's what we were doing with City COVID here, where they could actually model what was happening in the Chicago area. And in this case, they were using agent-based models. The going back up to the top, the prediction of synergistic drug combinations was a team led by ICANN School of Medicine to develop machine learning to predict whether a certain drug combination might be effective against viruses. Again, they were able to screen a lot of patterns for testing a lot of combinations, and they're now actually testing some of these combinations. Precision studies of the binding, how does it bind, how does it enter the cell and enter the body and infect the cells. This was by a group at the University of Missouri in Kansas City, again running on NERSC. And then the AI-driven drug discovery for SARS, COVID, protamine. And this, they screened over 6 million small molecules and identified 20 partially active molecules that could inhibit the viral function in wet lab experiments. And then those 20 then were tested in the wet labs. Arvid actually ran across many of the facilities with his COVID Consortium grant. So these are just types of things we did. I mean, we had people, researchers looking at how you could share ventilators and other things like that. And so the answer, because a lot of what we did was in basic science and therapeutic design, the total impact for what we did under these projects might not be known for several years. So we, like I said, we're still in existence, and especially with the prevalence of the Delta variant, we're focused on projects that can have near-term impacts in areas including the understanding and modeling of the patient response to the virus using large clinical data sets, learning and validating vaccine response models from multiple clinical trials, evaluating combination therapeutics using repurposed molecules, epidemiology models that are driven by large multimodal data sets, mutation and understanding and mitigation strategies. A lot of at least the first 4 bullets we got in discussions with big pharmaceutical companies to see what they were interested in. Again, they have their own HPC. But these were things that we were interested in. And you can see a lot of this is talking about data. And so let me come back to that, and, because that's one of the lessons learned that we had from COVID, is we needed to get, and this is the second bullet, we needed to engage with the broader stakeholder community such as NIH, FEMA, and CDC for maximum impact. If we'd had pre-negotiated agreements with these and similar stakeholders, it would have been important, because it was data that was really hampering us at one point. We didn't have these, we couldn't, we didn't have the policies, the procedures in place so we could use, show that we could, to NIH and FEMA and CDC, that we could protect data that had user identification in it. I think I've mentioned it before, the ability to leverage existing processes was critical and should be considered for future responses. Again, and going along with that, don't reinvent something that already works. Having a standing capability for the proposal submission and review process was critical for us being able to start this in 10 days. And I can't thank Exceed and NSF enough for sharing that with us. We still use it today. But we were not able, we didn't take the time to actually integrate the resources being provided. And especially with the members of facilities that were actually providing the resources. So we couldn't, once we gave an allocation, we couldn't really track that allocation through the process. We knew when they were able to get an account, because this is something else, again, the standing processes. And I have to give kudos to all of the member organizations. They were very diligent about making sure that these people got accounts in a reasonable time. And I would say just a few days at most. And so I think that's another way that we were able to speed things up, because these requests received priority within the facilities. Again, I go back to the broader stakeholders. It would have been beneficial to have use agreements in place for supercomputers and resources provided by U.S. government organizations. This goes along with my comment about the fact that I had on my website an allocation policy that said I could support national emergencies. Not all of the other federal agencies had that and had to get permission from their senior management and others so that they can participate. I mentioned data, being able to pre-position data, having data sharing agreements and codes that we could share would streamline projects and increase the impact. And because we didn't, I mentioned early on, we all agreed to do this with very little lawyer or no lawyer involvement. We were limited to open research, open publishable activities. But if we'd been able to address IP issues, had pre-planned IP policy between the member organizations and processes to protect the data, we could have done more, or we could do more. So now, where are we today? You saw the diagram on the left on my first slide that we've always been able to do. You know, HPC has been involved in supporting national emergencies for several years. The diagram in the middle is COVID, and it was primarily the COVID Consortium, but we were primarily focused on solving the pandemic, the challenges that the pandemic represented. And what we came to realize is that we need to do something more along the lines of the COVID Consortium going forward and proposed. And this came out through an RFI working with OSTP and NITRD subcommittees, the National Strategic Computing Reserve. And the idea there is we would be ready to do have members or a group or relationships, members that would be ready to support other national emergencies, not just a pandemic. And so we would investigate approaches and implement approaches. You know, it would be a standing group that would run, would recruit and sustain members. We would execute national or preparedness exercises built on successful, COVID experience. Gather, curate, and maintain critical databases depending on what the national, tornado, hurricane, weather, flood, drought, surge, storm surge in the case of floods, that kind of data that we would have it ready to go. We would develop agreements between members, execute and track progress, but it needs a sustained and coordinated investment. Like I said, OSTP released a RFI for information about what a national strategic computing reserve would look like in October of 2020. Responses were due in January of 21. And the link that I have at the bottom of the page here is actually what was just published this last October, or last month, but it's the National Strategic Computing Reserve Blueprint. So I encourage you all, if you haven't read it, to go read it, because you'll see a lot of the lessons learned that's come out of it and some of the things that I talked about on this slide. And with that, I think that's my last slide, and I will stop sharing and see if there's any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Barb. That is some deep, crucial detail. And the overall project is so both amazing and impactful for humanity.
Yeah.
I appreciate the scope of the membership. And a few times you mentioned the phrase how lawyers were not involved. And that seemed to help move some things along. But it seems behind that phrase then is even more of a powerful intention that the people at the table, in essence, the leaders who came together, decided we need to address this crucial problem, not get caught up on the same kind of protocols and usual processes that we bring to bear typically. Do you see that will continue to remain as the mindset around the consortium going forward with some of those next steps that you were outlining?
I think that is the mindset of the consortium. We're pretty proud of the fact that we don't have any written agreements, but we do recognize that we need those written agreements, because one of the responses to the RFI pointed out the need that we have to protect intellectual property. And again, I go back to the idea of protecting the privacy and data. It would have been nice if we would have had some of the CDC data, some of the data that people are collecting, that the medical industry is now collecting at hospitals on patients, but we just didn't have the procedures or processes in place, and wouldn't have been able to curate those data. And I think that's one of the important lessons learned going forward is you can't wait until a pandemic for this to happen. You have to think about this now. And hopefully, because of this blueprint that's out there, because of some, the interest of the consortium members to make sure that we're prepared for the next crisis, that some of this stuff will be addressed, that we won't forget about it in a year.
Could I ask if there was a favorite computer system, or otherwise, given your leadership of the ASCR, if you were particularly engaged or proud to see where computing resources from a given facility were part of a research project that manifested some deeper results?
Well, I was proud of all of the Oscar facilities. I mean, Argonne has supported city COVID, and that became important, especially in the National Virtual Biology Lab, the NVBL, of other things we were doing. So not only were we supporting the COVID, we were doing other things. Berkeley, with its COVID scholar, was important to keep us all informed of what was going on. And certainly the work that's on Summit, coupled with AI to look through things, was important. But I have to say a lot of important results came from Microsoft, Google, and Amazon. And one of the things I think beneficial, side benefits from this, is actually having the large compute facilities working more closely with the cloud.
All right. Well, let me look. I'm seeing if any of the audience members have questions or comments to Barb. Please enter those into our chat there. And I wonder if, let me ask, I reviewed much of the detail on the site in advance and wanted to have a couple questions for you if there weren't some coming from the audience. I'm curious what type of pipeline of labor force, if there's been any issues there in terms of the different facilities finding the computer scientists that they need to help operate these different research programs.
Certainly we have all kinds of, like everybody else, we have pipeline issues on running our big resources, but we've been, going on next week is a supercomputing conference. And I can say the Oscar facilities tie very closely into the supercomputing conference and the supercomputing challenge and the education programs that they have for students. And like every other person, we're looking to broaden the participation and where we can get students, and certainly looking at minority serving institutions and seeing what we can do there. But we do have issues because people on my facilities are recruited quite heavily from the Amazons, Googles, and Microsofts because of their experience. Yeah. And, one of the things that Oscar has at the same time, not only are we focused on computer science, but applied math, but we've had for 31 years the computational science graduate program, research program where we provide fellowships, computational science graduate fellowships. And we get some, at one point, I had a number of people who'd come out of that program in my facilities.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time today and giving us that thorough overview. And we will be looking to share this information further amongst our network.
Great.
And if there's any other type of outreach into the SURF network that we can help with, please stay in touch on that. Let me ask one last thing, of course, is how
Sure.
might people reach you, or where do you prefer to direct them to get more information or to ask questions?
Sure. They can, my email address is just my name, barbara.helland@science.doe.gov, and that's probably the best way to reach me.
All right.
And it's also on the Oscar website, so I think, yeah, that really is the best way to reach me.
All right. Well, thank you again very much for the time.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone in the audience, for watching. And we will have another session coming up here in just about 15 minutes. And look forward to seeing you at the next session for the SURF annual meeting. Thank you, Barb.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.